Okay, so in Lesson 7 we're going to talk about the concept of cultural context in relation to Macbeth and the cultural context readings, but also more broadly speaking, why cultural context is important for studying literature in general. And there will be a second part to this PowerPoint as well, where we talk about incorporating a cultural context section into your essays. I didn't ask you to do this in the first essay, but in the second essay and the final essay I am asking you to do that. So we're going to cover it in the lesson today. And so just like the first 3 lessons, there'll be a little bit of additional material that applies directly to your essays so that you can refer to this, fast forward to this part of the PowerPoint video when you're writing your essay if you need help. It won't be as long as those earlier lessons though, because the cultural context section is fairly straightforward to write. You probably just don't have much experience with it before, is mainly why I want to cover it. So why is cultural context important is one question you're probably thinking about right now. And why, also, the other question you're probably thinking of is, why would I ask you to read Cesario when I already asked you to read so much from the Bedford edition of Macbeth in such a short span of time? The answer to the second question about Cesario is much more straightforward, and that's simply that I think his essay provides the best example I can think of as far as explaining why cultural context is important. But he doesn't necessarily do that directly. It's kind of the implications of the essay rather than the direct topic of it. The topic of it is realism in the 19th century. And through talking about realism, Cesario ends up gesturing to why cultural context is important. So what I want to do in this first slide is explain, the concepts from his essay that indicate why cultural context is important, so that you understand it too. We started with cultural context in the first lesson, kind of in a little miniature form, when I had you read Blake and Malthus side by side. And so hopefully it was pretty clear there. The basic principle is that whenever a text is written, the cultural influences, the things going on around it historically, influence that production the production of that text to a certain extent. And we can have a better understanding of the text if we have a better understanding of the cultural context. Cesario says that history is self-contradictory. History is important because the majority of the time we're reading texts that have come before from the past. In this class we started very far back and we're gradually moving forward. We're in the Renaissance period right now, so kind of in the middle. And also, even if we're reading something very contemporary that was published in the last few years, like we will be at the end of the course, those texts are becoming part of history, or history is happening as we speak, so to speak. And so a lot of the important cultural context events and discussions we look at, those are part of history, is one way to think of it. So now you're probably wondering, what does he mean by self-contradictory nature of history, and why is that important? It's important because the self-contradictory history of nature explains why it's important to study literature from the past and past history. You've probably always heard that phrase, we need to study history so we don't repeat the mistakes of the past. If you know anything about history, you know that we're constantly repeating the mistakes of the past. It's almost unavoidable. And so once you think about that, you're probably asking, well, why study history? This is what Cesario has to say on it. He says, quote, "The social past contains the social practices of the future. Revolutionary modernity is informed by incoherent practices that sometimes derive from the past, sometimes gestate the future." So, essentially what he's saying here in this quote, what this means is that the past and the present, or the past and the future, or the present and the future, are much more similar than we think. We tend to construct these things as binaries, past versus present, etc. We talked about the danger of binaries in the very first lesson when we talked about literature versus reality, and how in many ways literature is reality or conveys truths about reality, so we shouldn't separate those categories the way culturally we're somewhat driven to. Same idea with past and present. ideas, concepts, social practices, things we totally, associate with the present, can be seen in the past too. You may be thinking of, say, something like social media right now as an immediate counterexample. Obviously, 200 years ago, social media didn't exist. But certainly gossip did, and if you look at texts that were written 200 years ago or take place 200 years ago, gossip was very important, is one example. So sometimes social practices change or adapted over the time, or something goes out of date, but then it comes back into practice, etc. And so what Cesario is saying is history is much more fluid. It's not about not repeating the mistakes of the past. It's about learning about the past because the past is connected to the present. There are similarities that are important for us to understand. We're doomed to repeat the same mistakes, but we can learn other things by studying the two in conjunction. So history is important for this reason. He goes on to say that history and reality, so again reality coming into the discussion, are multicultural revolutionary conflicts between different social orders that take place in long, drawn-out, mediated ways. This is a really good example of how history impacts our study of literature. So with this first point, we've discussed the importance of history to studying literature. The second point here from Cesario is how history impacts the study of literature. How does it actually affect the way we read books? And Cesario is challenging another assumption here. The first assumption he challenged was that history is not that important. The second one is that there's a kind of a one-to-one correlation that history happens quickly. It does not. It happens slowly is what he's saying here. A real good example of this might be, say, looking at a huge historical event like World War II and then looking at some of the books that were written around the same time or right after depicting characters, with PTSD or traumatic experiences in the war and seeing a direct correlation. Certainly that's one way cultural context can play out, but it's a much more slow, gradual process than that, typically speaking. If you think about something, say, like going back a little bit further, an obvious example would be the Great Depression and Steinbeck's The Grapes of Wrath. When we think about the Great Depression, even though the worst effects of it primarily happened over 3 or 4 years, it took proceeding into World War II and a lot of the reforms of FDR and whatnot to fully bring the country back to a more economic prosperous state over 20 or 30 years. And so that's a good example of a long multicultural revolutionary conflict, the example of slowly coming out of economic depression through World War II and beyond in the U.S. And the reason Cesario talks about it this way is because there's a lot more that happens in history than just major events, say like the Great Depression or World War II. History's taking place every day. If you look at the texts I'm asking you to read from the Bedford edition of Macbeth that give you more context to understanding Macbeth, these are not texts about major historical events. They're little essays and articles and what have you, and written by more everyday people, but they give us, by reading them, they give us an understanding of what was happening at the time, what issues and concerns people cared about at the time. And so the little voices matter just as much, so to speak. And so we can learn about, say, something like World War II or the Great Depression, but to really understand the cultural context surrounding a text, we also need to understand what daily life was like. If someone 100 years from now were reading texts written right now, they wouldn't just want to know about the war in Iraq and the recession of 2008. They'd also want to know about the popularity of social media and the kind of everyday changes that we experience on an everyday basis. So the first point was history is important to studying literature. The second point is that history happens much more slowly than we think, and so we need to look at the kind of everyday voices in addition to the big events when we think about the relationship between history and literature. The final point here is, again, about kind of going very similar to the first point, about the different ideas, the things we associate with past or present, and vice versa. He says, what is real or probable at one moment of history appears romantic and improbable in the next, and vice versa. So we tend to think of things that, say, seem supernatural or unrealistic in a text, and that's determined by what seems, unrealistic or supernatural at the time. So, the witches in Macbeth, at different points in history, those would be considered more supernatural than, say, at other points. In the 21st century, reading that, we probably don't know too many people who practice witchcraft, so that seems very romantic and improbable and fantastical. In the time he was writing it, though, there were witch trials and other things like that. So it's still a supernatural element in that there were witch trials all over Europe at the time, and later in the U.S., like I was saying. So they'd still seem supernatural, but it was a much more real kind of problematic social concern people were concerned with at the time. And we'll go through periods where that may change again, because history is an ever ongoing fluid process, and so you can't really, what Cesario is saying is unfair to set something up as this is outdated, this is part of the past, this will never happen again. It will happen again at some point. And so this is why studying history is important. So again, just kind of reiterating the first point with another quote that I think is really pertinent, especially because we're studying a text that has some very kind of supernatural and fantastic elements. And a lot of our texts do this semester because we're looking at the villains and the monsters as part of our theme. So the importance and making sure to look at the little voices in history, which are the kind of voices we see in Macbeth. So before we move on and talk about putting cultural context into your own papers, I'd like to talk about the examples from Macbeth. I've asked you to read a lot of them. It's a lot of reading on top of Cesario for this lesson. Part of the way I assigned it that way is I know you might not read all of them and you might consciously make that choice. I've given you more time for things like Dracula because obviously I want you to read all of Dracula. So I know you might make that choice. So I picked 4 out of the 6 sections that I thought you would think were most interesting. But I'm going to go through the basic premise of all 6 so that you have a good understanding of the cultural context that were chosen by the editor for this version. And I think he made great choices in that regard. It also, if you want to just read 1 or 2 essays from each section and get a good broad overview, that way that might be helpful too. Whatever works best for you. So as long as you get some of the reading done and get a good understanding of the cultural context surrounding Macbeth and why it's important. The first section is called Representations of Macbeth. I talked about a little bit about this on the last lesson where we were addressing drama in Macbeth more directly. But Shakespeare based a lot of his material, or almost all of it, on previously published things, either other plays or historical figures. And so Macbeth was a real king in Scotland, so was Duncan, so was Malcolm. Some of the other characters actually existed in Scottish history. Macbeth did kill Duncan. Beyond that, we don't know much more. But you have some excerpts here in this section from Hawson's Chronicles and other books that talk about the actual historical Macbeth. You also have some things in the second part of this section that were published after the play was written, so you can kind of see the impact, the influence the play had immediately at the time it was published if you take time to look at those pieces. The second one is called Discourses of Sovereignty. The question of sovereignty here is who has the right to become king, is essentially this question. And at the time Macbeth was writing, this was an important concern. At the time Shakespeare was writing Macbeth, this was an important concern because the monarchy had just transitioned from Elizabeth to James, who was actually a Scottish king. And we'll talk a bit about representations of Scotland next. But certainly their relationship was, they certainly didn't see Scotland as an equal. So this is a bit of an issue. So how do you determine sovereignty? How do you determine who the king is? And Macbeth has an interesting take on it, because you have Duncan, who inherits the throne. Macbeth kills Duncan in secret. At first no one else knows about it. and is basically puts himself on the throne. But because he's been glorified in battle and was given these awards by Duncan before he secretly murdered him, the people are basically okay with it. And then finally at the end you have Malcolm, who is kind of a combination of the both, because he's Duncan's son, so he's certainly entitled to the throne from hereditary rights, but he also seems to be the popular choice of the people. That's who they want in there after Macbeth. So you've got a variety of reasons here for how the three different kings we see in the course of the play take the throne. And so if you read this section, you'll see what people at the time were saying, different views of sovereignty and who should be king and why. And so, again, that kind of conflict over that informs why, if you see there's a conflict at the time over sovereignty, and then you look at the play and there's three kings that all become kings by different means, that's Shakespeare expressing that this was a struggle or a conflict at the time. The third one is treason and resistance. This one's probably very obvious. We talked in the last lesson about how Macbeth kills his king and takes the throne, so he clearly commits treason. The text that the editor, William Carroll, has chosen to put in here for this section, he calls them resistance texts. As in they were basically espoused political views that went against what the monarchy was in favor of at the time. And the idea here is the monarchy suppressed these texts. They didn't want them being read because they conflicted with the political views of the dominant ruling class, and so they're somewhat treasonous texts, so to speak. I also think there could be more in this section because there were numerous treason plots during Shakespeare's time. Treason, when you have a monarchy, treason was a real fear at this time. The best example is probably Robert Devereux, the second Earl of Essex. He was put into prison for treason. There were rumors he may have had a relationship with Queen Elizabeth. So this is kind of he's kind of a romantic, popular, rebellious figure at the time. And I don't have time to go into it now, but there have been a lot of essays written connecting this figure to Hamlet and arguing that his story is kind of allegorized or represented in Hamlet to a certain extent. So treason was a very popular and controversial topic at the time. It certainly, for the upper class in the monarchy, was certainly a threat that they feared and would see that fear in the play when reading Macbeth as a villain, but also was a popular topic with these kind of cultural examples of someone like Robert Devereux, who's kind of a romanticized popular figure at the time. So treason was also something people were really talking about then. And again, even the state we live in now, with the war in the Middle East, treason isn't something that comes up a lot. Perhaps because we don't have a monarchy, I'm not sure why. But so some of these topics kind of go in and out of cultural concern at different periods in history to connect this discussion back to society. The fourth section is the cultural construction of Scotland. So I was talking about this a minute ago when I mentioned that James VI, Elizabeth's successor in 1603, came from the Scottish throne, and I don't have time to go into that now, but it has to do with Mary, Queen of Scots, and that royal line, etc. But anyway, the idea here is that even though Scotland was part of the United Kingdom, and because it was part of the United Kingdom, a king from Scotland could become King of England, Scotland was still essentially viewed as a foreign country. If you look at these different texts Carroll's put in this section, it was thought to be wild and dangerous and barbarous and savage, and so really with a lot of the stereotypes that would be, say, used to describe a British colony at the time. And so we'll talk about the other in a few lessons, but Scotland was very much, otherized. It wasn't just part of England. It was very different. And so certainly you have in this play some elements that might not be in another play. For instance, in a country that didn't have this reputation or this relationship with England, you have witches, you have treason, you have these very kind of more kind of barbarous elements, you would say, right? The witches kind of contribute to that wild portrayal of Scotland as this kind of wild, uncivilized place. And the crime Macbeth commits, turning on his king, is something that might be considered barbarous or savage, right? It's certainly not something that would be approved of. So it's kind of putting these unsavory elements in this very otherized setting, this very foreign, other alien setting. And we might not think that immediately about Scotland, especially in the 21st century, it being part of the United Kingdom. So it's important to note this, and I think this is one of the most interesting of the cultural context sections. The fifth one is prophecy and witchcraft, which, I mean, that's just obvious here why that's there. Don't need to spend too much time on it. But certainly witch hunts are an important thing to mention. I mean, you're all familiar with the Salem witch trials, I'm sure. But I think without studying history too much, it's easy to think those were kind of the only witch trials of that magnitude. But there were plenty that went on in Europe well before then. So it was a real kind of cultural concern at the time, like I was saying earlier. Although it wasn't hunted as much or disapproved of as much in England as other European countries. But witch hunts primarily occurred to kind of help reaffirm the Christian monarchy, the absolutist Christian monarchy. And in England, people knew about both white magic and black magic, and it was more black magic that was disapproved of, and white magic was more part of British folklore, so the stance against witchcraft wasn't as staunch in England, but it was still very much a huge cultural concern. So, I think the witches are fascinating in Macbeth, so if you think so too, you might want to look at that section for your Blackboard post in terms of learning more about what people at the time thought about witches. The last section is discourses on the feminine. Again, this one is kind of obvious because of Lady Macbeth, Lady Macbeth too. And I have her on here because there are several feminine figures in Macbeth that are very important. Obviously Lady Macbeth, but Lady Macbeth too, I mean, the death of her and the children spurs, the final action of the play, and certainly the three witches. The fact that these characters are there and they're female. We talked about the feminine other, based off our earlier discussion of Grendel's mother in the last lesson. And here you have a woman, a lot of people argue, being the catalyst of some of the action here. And what we think of her is up to debate, like I mentioned in the last lesson. So if you're still pursuing that question of what to think of Lady Macbeth, reading this section and some of the pieces here on how women were treated at the time and what the cultural conception of women was at this time, then that'd be a very interesting section for you to look at. One important thing to note is that typo here, it should be Lady Macbeth versus Lady Macduff, is that Lady Macbeth has no children. Obviously, being a wife and a mother was one of the primary responsibilities for women at the time in this very patriarchal culture. So even among women, Lady Macbeth's lack of children kind of makes her stand out and kind of makes her into an otherized figure to begin with. And so some of the essays in that section get into that. And so obviously with the rights women had at the time, witchcraft, and then medical issues, certainly because Lady Macbeth essentially goes mad from guilt, those topics all come up in that section. How would, if Lady Macbeth were a real person, how would she be treated in terms of her illness is an interesting question to pursue, and some of the essays in that section can help answer that question. So things to think about. I hope you'll really think about going forward, because they're very interesting topics. Especially in your Blackboard course, when you go to actually pick one of the essays from this section and talk about how it, enhanced your reading of Macbeth. Alright, so how do you do this in an actual paper, right? If you, say, go and look at some essays on Macbeth, you'll probably find critics using sources like these to provide some background information to set up their argument. And that's essentially what I'm asking you to do in the second paper, is find and use some actual background information from the cultural context that is necessary for the reader to understand your argument, and bring that into the paper in a very small, short, brief section. So, how do you do that? It's very straightforward. You essentially just need to talk about this information, how it's important, tell the readers what they need to know so they can understand your argument better from this section. The close reading and the literature review, there were very kind of specific ways I went through to structure those sections. This is, as long as you have it there, and a couple of things we'll get to in a minute are clear, then you don't need to go into too much detail of how to structure it. Where to put it in the essay is a question that often comes up. So I would say typically after the intro, the reader needs this background, but they should still have the kind of basic introduction to your topic and definitely your thesis statement first, so that they know what you're arguing. Then they can read about this to kind of fill in the details. But I would still cover it before getting into the close reading in the bulk of your paper where you're analyzing the text. It can be very distracting to be reading a paper and the author's doing close reading, close literary analysis, and they're kind of going back and forth between that and either their literature review, citing the critics in the middle of the close reading, or citing, bringing in historical background as it's necessary. It's much more conducive to the flow of the paper to kind of clear the way, so to speak, by having, your topic clearly stated and your argument clearly stated in the beginning, and then kind of clearing the ground by giving the background, doing the literature review so they have that information when they need it, and then they can just read the analysis and just engage with your argument. So, like I said, very straightforward. After the intro or after the literature review, but certainly before the close reading. 2 things you need to do, and as long as you do those 2 things, the structure isn't as important. Or it's still important, but it can be, done really however you want, as long as it fits in one of those places and does these 2 things. The 2 things being, 1, clearly explain the necessary information for the reader to fully understand the cultural context. So these sections can go on. There could be a lot of interesting stuff to say. You could also say too little. So be sure to try to think of what do they need to know, what are the absolute things they need to know, and explain those things clearly. The second is to see how this relates to your argument, right? You don't want this section to feel like a tangent or like it's just thrown in. This really needs to relate to your argument. Clear connection there. The reader should have the feeling after reading this, oh, their argument makes way more sense now. It shouldn't be the feeling of, why was that there? But there should also be the feeling that they need it to understand your argument. If your argument can get by without this, you probably need a stronger argument or a stronger cultural context section, or both. So as long as you do those 2 things and fit this in somewhere early in the paper, but after you've stated your thesis, you'll be in great shape. We've kind of already answered this question, why does the reader need this information? Ask that of yourself when you're proofreading, and that's a way of making sure the information isn't extraneous, that they really need it. So it's very straightforward. That's all the information I think you really need to write this section. I do want to give you an example, though, because as straightforward as it is, you probably have not done this type of section before, at least in a literary analysis paper. So I'm going to use one of my own examples again. I like to use my own examples because I'm trying to show you that I'm struggling through the same things you are or have in the past. I mean, I still am. Writing is a constant struggle. It's a constant passion and a constant struggle for me. But also to say, I've been through this. I've received good advice on how to do this. I'm trying to give you the same advice now so that you can do well whenever you write literary analysis papers, whether it's for this class, another class, for the profession, wherever you're writing them. So this is from my essay on George Eliot's 1859 novel, Adam Bede. And my argument, my thesis is essentially the novel depicts a rural English village in the countryside. And there's this myth or this idea that the countryside is this very idealistic, idyllic, pastoral place that's like paradise, which isn't accurate because, especially, once the Industrial Revolution arrives, but even before. And so my argument is essentially that she debunks this myth in this book by the way she presents the village. So how do I use cultural context to enhance that argument? Well, at one point in the novel, one of the farmers says something in the rural dialect about the Napoleonic Wars, because it's set during the Napoleonic Wars, and he says the war is a good thing. And that immediately is a moment that stands out to me, because I think, why would you ever say the war is a good thing? But this gives me a way into my cultural context. I use the Corn Laws as my cultural context. Essentially, what happens is, in the middle of the 19th century, in the late 19th century, you have economic depression in the countryside because of the repeal of the Corn Laws. And the Corn Laws achieved the same effect as the Napoleonic Wars. What happened with the Napoleonic Wars is there's a blockade. And so no imports can really come into the country, into England, because of the blockade. And so the price of domestic crops that are farmed by British farmers are very high because there's no competition from foreign markets. Once the wars end, the prices start to go down because you have imported grain. So in 1815 they passed the Corn Laws, which prevent the import of grain. And then, I don't remember the exact year, I'd have to look it up, but the Corn Laws are eventually repealed because prices are too high for food, essentially. And so the Corn Laws are repealed, the foreign grain comes into the country. Corn, in the title of the laws, is meant to refer to all grains. So foreign bread and grains are coming into the country. Prices go down. Farmers can't get it's cheaper for the nation as a whole to eat, but farmers can't get enough work. They can't make enough money from their crops, so they leave the countryside. They migrate to the cities. The farms go out of business, etc. And you have this economic depression in the countryside that eventually happens. And so all this is to say that there's no golden age in the countryside, because without the Napoleonic Wars happening, there'd be economic depression. That's simplifying it a little bit, but you can see the cultural context, right? No one would understand why the Farmer Poyser says that the war is a good thing without understanding the context of keeping the prices high by keeping the imported grain out. And the Corn Laws enhance that argument because they show that there was this entire body of legislation devoted to this topic, and it was debated back and forth. You don't want the farmers going out of business, but you can't have food cost too much, so there's a huge debate, and the side of the food costing less eventually won, and it resulted in depression. So, George Eliot writing this is living during the Depression. So by putting that quote in there, this farmer's kind of forecasting what would happen if the wars ended and there weren't something like the Corn Laws in place. And so I use that to say, hey, there would be no golden age in the countryside because any kind of economic prosperity would be supported by the war. And then because it's a war, it's not really a golden age. So this is how I use the cultural context of the Corn Laws to help me make my argument. And so hopefully that's clear. I do some background on the Corn Laws. Everyone who reads the paper can kind of see why this was debated, why the farmer's mentioning something similar, and how that indicates, this stance about the price of food and the issue of the blockades and their needing to be there in order for the countryside to remain prosperous, which means there really is no golden age. That's just a myth, a superstition, a fantasy. So hopefully that's clear. If you have any questions about how to write a cultural context section in your second and third papers, please email me and I'd be happy to answer your questions. I also have one slide for you, which is places to find cultural context sources. If you're writing on Macbeth or Dracula, which are two of the four texts in addition to Sleepy Hollow and the Scouring of the Shire that you can write on for the second paper, you can use any. You only need one source for cultural context. You need 3 for the literature review, but just 1 for cultural context. You can use any of the sources from Macbeth or Dracula that are in those Bedford editions. If you want a different source or you're writing on the Scouring of the Shire or Sleepy Hollow, certainly feel free to email me and ask me for help in finding a source, but I thought I'd list some places and some ways to find sources here. Again, ASU being a big, huge Research 1 level library, there's lots of places there where you can find stuff. So I've listed a number of databases here that have things, from the 19th century, the 18th century, and further back. So searching in any of these would probably help you find what you're looking for. You also could look up the year your text was published on Wikipedia, and it'll give you major events that happened that year and other major texts, nonfiction texts that were published that year. So you can look through that list, and you can Google or Wikipedia search the years surrounding there too. And if it's a big important text from that time, anything published before 1923 is in the public domain and should be available online for free. And Google Books they have so much stuff. If you go to Google Books, they have almost everything that was published before 1923, and Project Gutenberg doesn't have as much, but they have a lot too. So, again, if you need help finding a cultural context source for your paper, please seek me out via email, but hopefully these methods and these places help you find one if you're not able to use one from either the Bedford editions.